What's that? Yeah, I am too as well. And I was a figure skater once upon a time, very, very long ago.
How are you connected?
Exactly.
Were you all figure skaters?
And I was very non-competitive, so I said to my husband this morning, I'm going to World Juniors. Words I never thought I'd ever. Perfect. Perfect.
No lazy pointer.
Physiologist, and Dr. Karen Ballinger is our phone. And the way we will run the seminar today is initially we'll have the speakers give a short presentation on their topic. We're keeping it brief so that it's open for a number of questions. I want lots of discussion because I'm sure you'll have lots of questions on the different aspects of it. I'll be monitoring the questions online, so we'll be answering those as well. And after each speaker is done, we'll move to the next speaker, and then we'll have an open discussion with all four of them. Okay? So just to introduce Karen, she has an interesting background as a figure skater. She actually is a silver medalist in synchronized skating, and she is a coach, and she's a technical specialist for synchronized skating. So she knows lots about skating, but she also knows lots about medicine, and particularly about pediatric medicine. She is a pediatric specialist, and she has a specialist in sports medicine, which she got from the University of Philadelphia. And I'm going to open up the speaker for her now to present her topic.
Hey, thank you very much for having me today. Today we're going to talk briefly about the physiology of growth and puberty and how that relates to unique injury patterns that we see in growing skaters. I could talk about overuse injuries for hours, so in the 15 to 20 minutes I have today, we're going to focus on some growth plate injuries as well as some bone stress injuries. And at the end, review how injury prevention fits into the skater's overall training, because ideally, if I never saw your athletes in my clinic, that would be the ultimate goal. When kids are growing, they grow at different rates depending on how old they are. So in infants and toddlers, we see a lot of growth, and then as they reach school age, it starts to flatten out before we see the growth spurt that we see in puberty. So in girls, normally puberty starts anywhere between 8 and 13 years, and then that growth spurt starts early in puberty and lasts an average of 2 to 3 years, reaching a peak height velocity of 8.25 centimeters per year. This occurs about a year before menarche, so a year before girls get their period for the first time, and then they continue to grow until approximately a bone age of 15 years. So bone age is exactly what it sounds like. We can take x-rays of wrists and looking at the growth plates in the wrist, what is open, what is closed. That can tell us how much growth is left. And usually someone's bone age is between either 2 years before or 2 years after their chronological age. And so because people have different bone ages, that explains why some people go through puberty at different stages within that normal range. When we compare it to boys, they start puberty a year later than girls, so normally between 9 and 14 years. And that growth spurt happens a little bit further into puberty and is a lot steeper, reaching a peak height velocity of 9.5 centimeters per year. And then they continue to grow until a bone age of around 17 years. And so these periods of high growth is where we see increased injury risk. And that's because the bones will grow in height, but the muscles and the tendons that need to support the bones as well as the athletic activity are slower to adapt. Research in teenage male soccer players showed that their highest risk for injury happened around age 12 to 14 when they were 88 to 92% of their peak adult height, so whatever they were going to be as an adult at that 88 to 92% range. So that's the number of injuries was most common at 12 to 14 years, whereas the highest burden or severity of injuries, days lost, was highest at 95% of peak adult height, which was around 14 to 16 years. In growing skeletons, there's always a weak link, and for our younger athletes, it's usually at the growth plate. So on that picture on the left of the skeleton, you can see the blue lines. Those are the growth plates. They are at the ends of long bones, as well as anywhere where important muscle structures will attach. And it's an area of weakness, risk for overuse injuries because there's so much. So this is, and whenever my athlete is landing, his quad muscle is pulling on his kneecap, which is pulling on the patellar tendon, which attaches into that front of the shin bone. And so in adults with overuse injuries, often we see patellar tendinitis or irritation of the patellar tendon as the weak link. In kids, they have this growth plate that's open. You can see that black line there that's made of cartilage, not of bone. And so the overuse and the tugging leads to injury at that area. This condition is named after two surgeons, Osgood and Schlatter, or known as tibial tuberosity apophysitis. And it happens in periods of high growth. So because girls had their growth spurts a couple years earlier than the boys, we usually see it in younger girls. So you're seeing it more in your novice age or a little bit younger, whereas you're seeing it in your younger junior men skaters. The risk factors include increasing activity quickly, so coming back from a summer break and jumping right into what you were doing before the break, and just having a high volume of running and jumping in general. And when we look at the athletes and their biomechanics, we notice that they often either have tight hamstrings and or tight quadricep muscles, depending on their sport. These types of injuries don't usually require a lot of investigations. I only get x-rays if I'm worried about something else, if it was an acute injury, sometimes if it's only on one side to make sure there isn't a bone stress injury or something else going on. And these injuries can be treated more with activity modification. They often don't need a prolonged period off the ice. So relative rest, modifying the number of jumps that they're doing, or how they're being spread out throughout the week, stretching those tight muscles so that we can prevent it from coming back in the future. And then some athletes find it helpful to take a patellar tendon strap, which goes in between the kneecap and the shin bone where it hurts, to help offload that pressure so we're not irritating the area. Some of you might have noticed there's also a black line at the bottom of the kneecap. That's another growth plate. That's another part that can get irritated. Usually we'll see this type of injury in younger skaters because that bone will show up. Well, it's always there, it's been cartilage, but it turns to bone a little bit sooner. This condition, also named after two surgeons, Sinding Larsen and Johansson, or SLJ condition. And so we see it, like I said, slightly younger, more your 7, 8 to 12-year-old athletes. And rather than it hurting over the shin bone, it hurts right at the bottom of the kneecap. Similar risk factors, similar treatment. Only thing that's different is that we don't have any good braces for this condition. So that's only two of the many growth plate injuries. I can always talk about more later. So moving on to bone stress injuries, another common injury pattern in figure skating. When we look at bones, all of us in this room, we always have a mix of bone breakdown and bone building activity. And if that balance gets out of whack, we're at risk of injury. In figure skating in particular, there's some risk factors that are inherent within the sport and our growing athletes that put them at higher risk. So first of all, every time they're landing their jumps, they're getting at least 5 to 8 times their body weight through that bone. And so even on a normal bone, that is an abnormal force. Then when we add our adolescent athletes, it's this transient state of low bone mass. So as they're growing in height, similar to the muscles and tendons being slower to catch up, the bone mass itself is lower for a short period, and then it's able to rebuild and make up for that change in height. So that's for all of our teenage.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think that was an excellent summary, and I'm impressed how much you got in the short period of time I gave you to speak, so thank you. It's a great introduction to our developing adolescent athlete. And so from there, we'll go to the exercise physiologist, Jelena. She's a registered clinical exercise physiologist in the high performance specialization through the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology. Yes?
Would it be possible to get the slides afterwards, or
Yes? Yes. And it's all being recorded as well, so it will be on the ISU website, the whole session. I understand that the live video is cutting in and out because of our internet. We're trying to get that fixed. So I do understand that, and I thank you for the information on the chat line for letting me know that. So if it is cutting in and out, we'll just put another line in, hopefully that it will improve. But there will be recording so that if it does cut out, you can watch the full recording later as well. Okay? So introducing Jelena, registered clinical exercise physiologist. And she currently is with the Canadian Sport Institute in Calgary here. She is a testing coordinator for the mountain sports and development figure skating. And she is currently studying for her master's in science, focusing on concussion. Jelena?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, really. Okay, so we're going to get into planning and training physical capacities in adolescent figure skaters. And just before we really dive in, what are physical capacities? All I mean for the purposes of today are athletic abilities, physical demands on an athlete. So examples include endurance, strength, flexibility, agility. So planning and training these kind of athletic abilities. And so I'm going to obviously talk about the physiology side of things, the physical capacities, but I just want to acknowledge that we don't have the opportunity to train these physical capacities without taking into account the whole healthy athlete and all these other components. So I like this model here by Smith and Norris, athletic performance at the top. I like to think of that as the whole healthy athlete that is successfully performing and hopefully gets to the senior level and stays there a while, so has longevity to their career as well. And then to make up that whole healthy athlete, we have obviously physiology, which we'll go into, biomechanics, how the athlete moves, the psychology of the athlete, which we'll hear more about, tactics, that's the technical training side of things on the ice, what the coach is doing day to day, and then health and lifestyle, I prefer to branch out even further to include many other aspects, so just a few: sleep, nutrition, stress. So we'll see some examples soon, but all of these interplay into one another. I think we all intuitively know, for example, if you're not getting adequate sleep, then your physiology performance will be influenced and so on. So. Okay. We're going to go into what are the physical demands on figure skaters, when we should train these in adolescent athletes, and then just briefly how. So what, when, and how. So it's a nice model to start off with was placing the sport of figure skating within this triangle of between strength, speed, and endurance. So for example, if you had a weightlifting sport, you'd put them pretty much right on top of strength over there. Speed, you might have like a sprinter speed skater, for example, is on the speed. Marathon runners are on the endurance aspect. So just think to yourself for a moment, where would you put as a whole general sport figure skating in this triangle? For me, I would put it in the middle. You have to be good at everything. So great, we narrowed it down. In terms of the speed to endurance continuum, we're not talking about marathon runners, hours of training, and we're not quite talking about sprinters within, the seconds. Obviously, we're in the minutes category, but you have to be able to train all of these aspects and really focus on all of them, and include many other components as well. So stability, power, flexibility, agility, coordination. There's so many things that go into the physical abilities of an athlete, of a figure skater in particular. So let's get specific. I'll show you some research on figure skating, and we're going to talk about heart rate. So this is really fascinating research to me. I'll show you heart rate data in a moment. So on the top part of the graph is a short program. On the bottom part is the free program. Across the horizontal axes are the length of the program, so we have time, and then you have 1, 3, and 5 minutes post. And then on the vertical axes, we have heart rate. So for example, on the right-hand side, we have percent of their max heart rate. So if you see a dot up above near 100%, that means they're working at 100% of their maximum heart rate. So this is the graph. Basically, this is an average of a bunch of skaters put together, and really what I take away from this is at about 45 seconds to a minute into the program, these figure skaters are working at pretty much, give or take, maximal heart rate for the remainder of their programs. This, short and free are together, which is just phenomenal. Like, the amount of lactate being produced and anaerobic capacity needed to sustain it and look amazing like they do. So it's just being aware, this is truly a maximal sport. We'll narrow in on a tracing of a single athlete now to see kind of the ebbs and flows of a program. So across the bottom we have time, and then on the vertical axis we have their heart rate, this time in beats per minute. So, depending on the athlete, maybe around 190 to 200 might be max in this example. So we'll look at the black line when it comes up. So we get a bit of a better idea of the heart rate throughout a program now. Obviously, there will be ebbs and flows as you ramp up to go into a jumping pass, or you have a choreographed moment to catch your breath a little bit. However, if you see, at the top of the black line, maybe we're at 199 heart rate or so, and at the bottom, past the 30-second mark in, we're at 189. So even if we have a choreographed rest, you might only get 10 beats per minute kind of rest. So you're hanging up there for a while. I will preface that this particular graph is from a roller figure skater, and I know these are very different sports, but I do think we can draw parallels, and just with my experience, I do think this is similar. Another interesting aspect of this study, so we have the black line was doing their program in training, and then the red dotted line was at competition. And this was within the same week, so there wouldn't be much difference in training ability. And the research, you can see obviously that the red line is higher, the competition heart rates were higher. And the researchers really concluded with lots of information that this was the psychological stress of competition, which we might intuitively guess as well. So this goes kind of back to this graph. All these components feed into each other. So for example, in this example, the psychology influences the physiology. And then I'll go back again. In this same study, the athletes that had a higher degree of cardiovascular fitness to begin with had a lower separation between training and competition. So if you go in with a higher level of cardiovascular fitness, you can kind of modify the psychological stress that influences the change in heart rate. So then we go back to this, the physiology influences the psychology. It all comes together. We can't isolate just athletic abilities. So that's just a little bit of what are the physical demands on figure skaters. Let's go into when we should train these in adolescent athletes, and I'm really happy Dr. Bullinger already kind of touched on this. We're going to get into growth and development a little bit. So again, so many physical capacities, physical abilities. We're talking about all of these. So this is a similar graph that you've already seen. I know it's a lot on the slide, but I'll explain it all. So we'll zoom into the top part of the graph. We'll just look at females for now. And in the middle of the graph across the horizontal, you'll see age. And so the red solid line throughout is an example of height velocity, which you already saw today. Peak height velocity is something quite important to measure, in my opinion, because there's windows of accelerated adaptation that you can train certain physical capacities. So I'll just give some examples. The dotted boxes that include stamina and strength, these are related to after an athlete goes through their growth spurt, these accelerated windows that you can train and get adaptations. I'll come back to this. Basically, an example is that these gymnasts are all 14 years of age and obviously look quite different. So would you train the athlete on the left the same way as you would train the athlete on the right, even though they're the same chronological age. You know, intuitively, we'd probably say, okay, we need to have some differences here. So if we go back to this slide here, it's important to measure this peak height velocity so that you know when the growth spurt is happening, so that you can train your athletes different and take advantage of these windows of adaptability. So same thing on the bottom for males. Obviously, we see that peak height velocity happens later, and the strength, for example, the dotted box that includes strength, the window to really train that is much later. And I think sometimes we intuitively know that as well. And just to be clear, all of these capacities are very trainable at any point in time, but you can get, you know, so to speak, the most bang for your buck in these certain windows, so it's nice to know about these areas. Okay, and then just briefly, how do we train this? Well, of course, strength and conditioning, cross-training, off-ice training. I think we know this. I really like the sentence of, you have to off-ice train or dry land train to support the demands of the on-ice training to meet the demands of performance. So obviously our performance is only 3.5 minutes long for a junior free program, but the training is hours and hours on ice each week. And so to support those hours and hours of training, you need to do the off-ice training to support the hours of training to meet the demands of a 3.5 minute program. So it's all backwards from there. Strength and conditioning, really maintaining health, structural tolerance, building performance strength, building those strength reserves, especially in those windows that we saw before, has been shown to reduce injury risk, which it all correlates to one another. And it's, like I said, to help the athlete meet the demands of on-ice training. So the good health state, injury recovery, pain-free, restriction-free movement, the quality of the movement, and to be ready for new demands. Like there's new, obviously, requirements each year from the ISU that comes out, the rules, what do you have to do to meet the requirements this year to get your levels. If you're doing your off-ice training and you have that bucket to pull from, whether that's flexibility to, get your illusion or the strength to do some different combination or sequence, then you're ready for it, the new demands. So the takeaways, I blew through this. The takeaways I'd really like to leave with you are athletic abilities are influenced by more than just the training, by the physical side of things. And truly, there's research that correlates it very directly. There are windows of accelerated training adaptations through adolescence that are good to know about. So if you want to read more about this is peak height velocity that you would look up. How to measure this in your athletes would be, if you have the privilege of working with them through their lifetime, you would measure their height every 4 months and you'd get an idea of their growth spurt. If an athlete just comes to you, there are ways of kind of predicting where they are in their peak height velocity. If you want to look it up, University of Saskatchewan has a resource where you do a few measures and you can predict where they are on that growth curve. So University of Saskatchewan peak height velocity is what you'd look up. And then, just to emphasize, all of these skills are very trainable all throughout life. It's just there's windows where you can make more adaptations quicker. And I just, on the side, because I research concussions and I'm into the brain lately, the brain is just getting started, so lots of other adaptations can be made as well. And then off-ice training has to support the on-ice training to meet the demands of a successful performance. So, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jelena. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I think it points out really well the areas of window of opportunity for your intensive training and then also your rest areas so that you can prevent those overuse injuries that Karen was speaking about. Also for our online people, I see that the online stream is working better, so I hope you're enjoying the presentation more than the interrupted one that started. So, and thank you, Jelena, also for the segue into our psychologist. It was nice to know that everything is connected, which we always thought it was, and the brain is just developing. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Joan Hilson, who's going to speak to us about the psychology in sport. Her specialty is resilience, and I think our skaters always show a lot of resilience, both in training and in competition. She is a clinical psychologist, and she trains and mentors others and provides assessment and treatment services to clients with a special focus on on their experiences from repeated trauma. And she really focuses on core values and living true to those, developing resilience. Thanks.
So I don't know if we've got my slides. There we go. Thank you very much, Dr. Ballinger. There we go. And I'm going to go to the slideshow here and let us start from the beginning. I don't know if this is a touch screen or not. I'm used to a touch screen, and I always touch other people's screens and they get not happy with me. Too far. So thank you very much for having me, and it's just a delight to be speaking with all of you. And once upon a time, I was a very non-competitive figure skater, and I had the privilege of saying to my husband this morning, I'm going to World Juniors, words that I thought I would never utter. So I'm so pleased to be here. I have a private practice, and I deal with individuals who are very high performance people, not necessarily athletes, but individuals who typically are very passionate about their careers from very early ages, incredibly driven individuals who work so very, very hard to develop for themselves the life that they want to have in their career. And often they do achieve high levels of excellence. And also often it is the case that their careers conclude quite naturally, but at very young ages, relatively young ages. And they still have a lifetime yet to live. So I'm interested to talk with you today, and very honored to speak with you today, about how not only we support the psychology of young elite athletes, but how we also prepare them for a future beyond skating. I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the common psychological conditions that are seen in youth, in all of us, frankly, and also in the young athlete. There's actually a dearth of data around the intersection between youth, high performance, and mental health. So we need to do a lot of extrapolation from what we know in other areas. But it's such an area that really, really requires a much deeper dive, this intersection between youth, high performance, and mental health. So I will talk to you a little bit, though, about what I believe to be the case for young athletes. Then I'm going to turn and speak about resiliency, what that is, what that isn't. I'm going to speak about 7 factors that we can train on in order to have better resiliency, with a special focus on one of those factors of resiliency, and that's identity. Who we are as people, not just what we do, but whom we are. And so we shall begin. So, common psychological conditions for all of us, but including athletes: anxiety and depression. For athletes and youth, more so, also issues around body dysmorphia and disordered eating conditions, which I'm sure you are all more than familiar with, and it's easy to do a little bit of research on one's own if one needs more information on what those conditions look like. I want to emphasize that it is generally believed that 1 in 5 of us at any point in time are likely to suffer from a diagnosable mental health condition. Okay, we say 1 in 5, 20% of us. That's high, but that also means that 80% of us are not suffering. But it doesn't mean that 80% of us are not suffering. Those rates are about diagnosable conditions, meeting diagnostic criteria, and there needs to be quite a high symptom load of sufficient severity and sufficient duration before we meet diagnosis. There's a lot of our youth, and even more so these last number of years, who are really suffering. They may or may not meet diagnostic threshold for conditions such as these, but that doesn't mean that they don't have symptoms that are impacting performance and impacting quality of life. You know, over half of mental health conditions are believed to have developed before the age of 18. And yet, 58% of those cases go undiagnosed and therefore untreated. And interesting, when it comes to your population, there is research out there that indicates that there is especially high stigma when it comes to mental health where high performance athletes are concerned. They don't want to cry out and say, I'm hurting, I need help, because they fear the consequences for their competitive career. Am I not going to be selected for teams? Am I going to not have certain opportunities? So we've got an awful lot of youth, including high performance athletes, who are hurting, okay? I really think there needs to be a call to action to pay attention to that, because in fact, when we deal with mental health issues, it actually increases functioning, increases capacity for training, increases opportunity to be successful in performance. So I just really implore for the community to take note of that. Now, adolescence isn't a psychological condition, but my goodness, do puberty and adolescence impact the mental functioning? Any of you who regularly deal with youth, and all of you do as coaches, as trainers, and as parents maybe, know that adolescence is a beast unto its own. And that is because the brain is very, very different than the brain of the prepubescent child or of an adult, okay? Adolescence is defined as beginning with puberty and ending, frighteningly, at about age 25. And in between those years, what we've got is a limbic system, the emotional center of our brain, that's absolutely on fire, and that's okay. But when you couple that with a prefrontal cortex, which is where rational thought occurs, decision-making, consideration of long-term consequences, that is woefully deficient. It has been described that the adolescent brain is the brain of a temporarily brain-damaged individual. Okay? There's an excellent book. It is a parenting book, but the first few chapters of it does a fantastic job of describing the neuroanatomy of the adolescent brain, and it is called Yes, Your Teen is Crazy: Loving Your Child Without Losing Your Mind. The author is Dr. Michael J. Bradley, and if you want to learn more about the adolescent brain and its impact on what you're seeing with the youth that you are regularly interacting with, I can't recommend that enough. Okay. But moving on, okay, we know that kids might be hurting. Your high-performance athletes, there's a very good chance they might be hurting and they're not raising their hand and letting you know about that. I want to talk about resilience. Resilience doesn't mean we are not hurting. It doesn't mean that we are people of steel who are not impacted by disappointment, by loss, by stress, but rather resilience means we've got the capacity to restore wellness, to recover, and in fact even flourish. There's lots of science that indicates that individuals who go through difficulty and are able to navigate that difficulty actually emerge bigger, stronger, and better. It's not unlike training muscles, right? You put them under stress, there's some breakdown, and with rest and recovery and nutrition, you emerge bigger, better, stronger. Same thing psychologically. So again, resilience doesn't mean you're protecting your athletes from hurt psychologically, but rather you're equipping them to be restored, okay? So it's not a personality trait. It's not fixed. It doesn't come naturally. It's not really accurate from an empirical standpoint to say, oh, this person has resiliency and that one doesn't, okay? Resiliency, instead, it's a learned skill. And so again, we're going to talk about 7 factors quickly with a focus on one especially to help resiliency be learned, to train up that muscle of being able to adapt, recover, and emerge bigger, better, stronger, okay? But it does require intentional effort. So what are some of those pathways? This is merely a selection of pathways. There are more, of course. However, let's start with acceptance. What do I mean by acceptance in this context? First of all, I mean accept that your young athletes might be hurting, and we can't ignore that, okay? It needs attention, and giving it that attention is going to help our young people recover, and that is actually in turn going to enhance longevity in career, and it's going to enhance performance within that career. Second, giving our athletes, whether it's with parents or others, a strong sense of connection, belonging, being cared for. You know, there was a very, very large meta-analysis bringing together of data. I think it was 144 studies, the data from something like 500 or 600,000 participants. It was published out of Brigham Young University about 4 years ago, and it looked at risk factors which either prevent or are protective where it comes to future morbidity and mortality. Mortality, death, morbidity, unwellness. And it wasn't narrow at all in its scope with regard to how morbidity was looked at. What was looked at were a whole host of physiological outcomes and mental health outcomes as well. The single biggest predictor of not being dead in X number of years, also the single biggest predictor of being able to overcome things like a cancer diagnosis or not develop cardiovascular disease, or not be having issues with inflammation or future fertility. The list went on and on and on with regard to outcome variables. The single biggest predictor of wellness was not being lonely. That was way more important than diet, whether or not we had a sedentary lifestyle, whether or not we had a family history rife with disease, whether or not individuals were of high, moderate, or low socioeconomic status. The single biggest predictor was safe, secure relationships, okay? But I should qualify that. The loneliness piece was tied with one other variable, and that variable was whether or not we smoked. Smoking 12 to 15 cigarettes a day is bad for our health. We all know that. There's public service announcements. Cigarette packaging has changed. But equal in terms of impact was loneliness. And I think this is a factor for the competitive athlete who may be distant from their peers, who may leave their families to go away and train. Okay? We need to be looking after their sense of connection. Another research finding, being able to navigate the ratio of positive to negative mood states is incredibly important for our wellness. And if you want to remember one little ratio, science tells us that when we spend roughly 3 times the amount of time in a positive mood state relative to a negative, we tend to be more resilient. Again, we can recover. So, there's opportunities to get creative about this. We can't control always the negative mood states that we find ourselves in, but if we can be intentional when we or our young athletes are having a hard time, What is going to give them a lift? And that's going to vary from athlete to athlete. For somebody, it's going to be going for a run if that's a mood elevator for them, so long as it doesn't cause overuse injuries. Okay? Hanging out with their friends. Okay? That may or may not work for a given athlete. Personally, myself, I like to listen to stand-up comedy. Okay? Go to a funny movie. What is it that makes your athlete laugh or smile or have a little bit of mood elevation? Be intentional about encouraging those opportunities. That promotes resilience. We know that practicing mindfulness and the mental training is really important. I'm not going to delve into that too much. There is a burgeoning area of research called self-compassion. There are over 4,000 studies currently that I'm aware of, approximately. That was the last count, stemming from the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, University of Texas. When we practice self-compassion, which also involves acceptance of, I'm having a hard time right now, okay? And I'm going to allow space for myself to name it, not suppress it, not push it away, not deny it, but I'm going to name it. I name it to tame it. Cheesy saying, but the research very much tells us that when we name our difficult emotions, it actually helps with that emotional regulation piece. Okay? The other is holding space for ourselves to walk through those difficult periods. Again, cheesy saying, I'm going to feel it to heal it. We know that when we navigate those difficult emotions, it actually leads to resolution, okay? Which for the competitive athlete is going to reduce stress, which is going to improve physiological performance and enhance potential for some competitive success. Okay. I indicated earlier the science that shows that youth high-performance athletes are very reticent to acknowledge mental health difficulty. Let's increase the conversation and let's make sure that psychological resources are available and our athletes are feeling confident about using them without threat of negative reprisals for their competitive career. But what I want to speak most about is identity. So let me tell you a story. The people I work most with in my career, I indicated earlier, are high-performance individuals, okay? They know early on what they want to do. They dig in, they work hard, they achieve success, they get into that career, and they tend also to excel, most of them in that career. Very type A individuals, okay? But generally, by relatively young ages, that career has concluded. And the problem with so many of my clients is that they have over-identified themselves with their career, okay? I am not Joe Smith, rather, I am X. I am what I do. And how often, I ask, is that the case with a high-performance competitive athlete? Do they know who they are independent of what they do? Okay, I see some nodding of heads. This is an issue, right? So what is identity? It's a sense of self. I think I pressed the wrong button here. No, I did. It's a sense of self, okay, independent of what we do. Who am I? I am not what I do. As wonderful and as important and impactful as what I do may be, still, what I do is not whom I am. And who I am is certainly not my successes and my failures. How often is it said in the athletic world, so-and-so is a 6-time Olympic medalist? They've been incredibly successful. They do have 6 Olympic medals, but that's not who we are. Language matters. And I know it's all too easy to fall into this trap of describing ourselves or others in terms of our successes or sometimes our failures. Who is she? Oh, she's that person that bombed out in that competition on the world stage. No, she's not. She did bomb out in that competition. But I really implore you to work with your athletes on helping them figure out, and this is a developmental step that is necessary for all adolescents, for them to figure out, who am I? Okay? And maybe even a little bit more so the competitive athlete. So how do we do this? How do we help people foster a healthy identity? Okay? Allow for them to have some balance, okay? And yes, this is an opportunity for them also to have rest. Help them to, while not threatening the demand that needs to be on them with regard to training and competition, how can you find place in their life for them to have other experiences also and experience themselves as still being whom they are, but across different aspects of their life? Give our athletes an opportunity to have balance and values. So the work of Kelly McGonigal, Stanford University. She's done a bunch of fantastic things, but among the things she has done is helping people understand the values, the personal values, what I deem to be important as factors in motivation, okay? Which is also incredibly relevant for the competitive athlete, okay? But she points to different strategies by which we can help ourselves and others dig deep and ask, why am I doing this? And she will ask why, again and again and again to help people go deeper. And when we are able to identify and connect with values, that's part of whom we are, including the competitive athlete. Why are you training? Okay? Well, because I want to be competitive. Why do you want to be competitive? Well, because I want to do well in that competition. Why do you want to do well in that competition? To prove to myself that I can work hard. Now we're starting to get to values, hey? This particular athlete might value hard work, okay? Well, how are they having opportunity to live out and experience that value in other areas of their life? Okay? And encouraging them that they are a person who doesn't just do what they do, but they are a person who values hard work. Okay? That would just be one example. Okay? Many values, and those values are going to differ athlete to athlete. My next point, prepare your athlete for retirement early. Now, I don't mean be explicit about this and hammer it home to your athlete. You know, you've only got a certain number of years in this career. That's not what I'm talking about. But you, as coaches, as trainers, as parents, as sports psychologists, as other healthcare providers, in the background, you're being mindful of the fact that this person isn't just what they do. You're helping them discover whom they are, which is going to prepare them for a life beyond skating. Whether they go on to senior ranks and spend a number of years there or not, and hopefully they can and they do, and maybe they want to, and you're there to support that journey. But still, just like my clients, they are going to retire early. And we don't want them experiencing the identity crisis that my clients experience when they retire early. We want to support their well-being and help them understand. You're kind of doing this subtly and in the background, a little more explicitly as they're getting further on in their careers. Understand and appreciate they are going to have transferable skills for careers and lives beyond the rink. Okay? Did you know that young people entering the workforce today, and I'm not talking about competitive athletes here, but young people entering the workforce today, it is predicted that they will likely have 6 to 7 careers in their lifetime. Not jobs. You know, I'm a professional engineer and I work in oil and gas. Now I work in regulation. Now I work in something else. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking somebody who may begin as a competitive athlete. Then maybe they're going to pursue physiotherapy. Then maybe they're going to pursue medicine. Then maybe they're going to be a teacher, okay? But there's going to be a common thread that runs through that life of change, and I believe that that common thread is our values and our identity. And I think when we focus some training on that, we're going to build resiliency, we're going to create better, healthier athletes, mentally, physically, athletes that actually have more potential for success now, but also who are much more likely to have well-being well into their futures beyond the rink. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joan. That was very interesting, and it not only gave us insight into the adolescent brain, but also into, I'm sure some of us are thinking of our own identity and our values and how we can put resilience into our health and have a healthier life ourselves, as well as transfer that to our athletes. So thank you once again. Now I'd like to introduce Erin Creel. We're very fortunate to have Erin here today, and she's going to make sure that we know how to fuel and have our brains and bodies healthy through nutrition. Erin is a registered dietitian, and she currently works with a number of athletes through the University of Calgary, the college, what's the other college here? McLeod? What's the other college that is here?
Say that again?
University of Calgary and the other college that's here?
Mount Royal University.
Mount Royal University, that's one. And so she works with the athletes at the University of Calgary, Mount Royal University, and elite athletes at the Canadian Sport Institute. She is particularly skilled at identifying mental barriers to food regulation, and she has studied postgraduately through training in anthropogenetic composition testing, eating disorders, and allergen management. So I'd like to introduce Erin today to talk about nutrition.
Thank you so much. So when Dr. Morin had asked me to come up with a title for my presentation today, I came up with Fuel the Nutritional Sow Cow. I am not a figure skater. However, doing some brief research, I understand that the sow cow is more or less, in its beginning stages, a pretty basic move, if I am correct. So just like the sow cow, fuel and nutrition, diet in general, fairly beginner. It's not something that's necessarily covered at a very young age in the sporting world, just because it is a fairly new science, but very important topic nonetheless. So today I wanted to talk about the importance of fueling for sport and the risks of underfueling. So we understand that nutrition is important for a variety of reasons. It allows for better training, greater performance, fewer illness, less risk of injury, better recovery after training, and ultimately long-term health. If we think about the basic training process and what's happening to the body when we train and exercise, do strength and conditioning to become fitter, faster, and stronger. And through the training process, our muscles and joints are all being stressed. So the only way to achieve all of these performance benefits is with quality nutrition to repair and refuel the body. Without good nutrition, we stay in a vulnerable state, fairly broken down, if you will. We find that athletes get sick more often as their immune system is put under stress. It's a missed opportunity to build muscle that athletes work so hard for in the gym, and a much higher risk of injury. If we think about energy availability, nutrition is important to sustain our energy levels. We need enough energy to support our body's health, daily activity, growth, and training. So energy availability refers to the amount of energy left over and available for the body's functions after the energy expended for training is subtracted. So we have the food and drink we eat, our fuel, minus the cost of exercise and training, and we are left with the energy available to the body. Lots of times when athletes are not fueling adequately, or if they were overtraining and expending too much energy, they enter a state of low energy availability. So our body is forced to compensate by slowing down or decreasing some of the necessary functions of the body to conserve energy. So we find athletes enter a state of poor health. As mentioned, higher risk of injury, higher risk of illness, low iron status, particularly in female athletes, oftentimes low mood and depression, poor reproductive health, again, primarily in female athletes with the loss of the menstrual cycle, reduced bone quality, which Dr. Ballinger was talking about with stress fractures and injury to the bone, gastrointestinal upset. So we find a lot of time that athletes who are not fueling adequately, their stomachs simply cannot take on the added food without significant gastro training. With low energy availability, we also see poor performance a lot of the time, decreased muscle strength, decreased ability for glycogen storage and repletion following exercise, decreased endurance capacity, decreased focus and coordination, low energy levels. As the title states, low energy availability, you're probably not going to feel too great, and poor adaptation to training. So when we have a chronic state of low energy availability, we're at risk of developing a syndrome called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S. Some people say REDS. I don't know why I say RED-S, but it is what it is. So RED-S is a fairly new term in the sporting world. It was previously referred to as the female athlete triad, which was characterized by low energy availability, low bone density, and the loss of the menstrual cycle. However, with new research, we found that it doesn't just affect females, it affects males as well. In a lot of cases, I've actually worked with more male athletes in RED-S than female athletes recently, which is quite interesting. So a lot of similar health and performance side effects with RED-S to LEA. We see effects to the immune system, menstrual function, bone health, endocrine function, resting metabolic rate, iron status, growth and development, relationship with food, mental health, GI issues, just whole slew of issues. And then we also see all the performance side effects, the decreased strength, depression, irritability, decreased coordination. So lots of different things that go into RED-S and the side effects of that. So as I mentioned, RED-S and LEA can affect athletes of any sport, any age, body size, culture, socioeconomic status, gender, athletic ability. So we're seeing it now in athletes from the most novice of levels to elite levels. So definitely something to be aware of, the red flags and the warning signs for that. So how can we prevent low energy availability and RED-S? Kind of 5 big things that have come out: eating frequently, eating around our training schedules, eating to match our training volume, planning ahead, and working with a sport dietitian. So eating frequently throughout the day, trying to eat every 3 to 4 hours to attempt to meet energy demands if possible. So oftentimes that looks like 3 meals plus snacks as needed. And a lot of times we like preaching the sandwich method surrounding training, so having a snack pre-training and then immediately post-training, just so we can optimize glycogen stores for training. Eating around training, similar to what I had just said, trying as best as possible to do that sandwich method surrounding training. A lot of athletes will follow a 3-2-1 rule leading into training, so 3 hours pre-training, attempting to have a meal that is a little larger in quantity, a nice balance of carbohydrates, protein, dietary fat, and vegetables or fruit. 2 hours pre-training, trying to have a bit of a mini meal, I'll call it, or a larger snack, primarily simple carbohydrates and some protein. And then about 1 hour to 30 minutes before training, having just simple carbohydrates that will be digested quickly and utilized efficiently as energy during training. And then going into our training sessions, if it's going to last longer than an hour, trying to have, again, some form of simple carbohydrate to help support energy levels throughout that. And then immediately after training, again, trying to have another snack, oftentimes a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio carbohydrates to protein to help recover the body efficiently. So with athletes who sometimes have a 2-a-day training schedule, as you'll see on the bottom example there, again, trying your best to get in as many feeding times as possible to actually support the demands that the training session is going to require. Eating to match training volume. So a lot of times with the adolescent athletes, what they're taught in school is the plate method from Canada's Food Guide, which shows half a plate of color, fruits and veggies, a quarter of a plate lean protein, and a quarter of a plate of whole grains. The athlete's plate is quite a bit different. You'll see the blue plate on the left characterizes basically Canada's Food Guide, half a plate of color, quarter of a plate whole grains, quarter lean protein. So that would be a really good plate to follow leading into a light training day or maybe a rest day. As our training volume increases and the intensity of our training increases, so does the amount of carbohydrates we need. So if I have a moderate training day, maybe I'm doing a strength and conditioning workout or I'm on the ice, I would try to increase the amount of carbohydrates I'm having and decrease my other sections of the plate. And then hard training day, maybe I'm on the ice twice or I have strength and conditioning and on ice training. I would try to have half a plate of carbs, quarter of a plate protein, quarter of a plate of vegetables. So carbohydrates are your best friend as an athlete and very important to sustain our training volume and energy during training. Planning ahead is also a big one for athletes, especially we have a lot of student athletes trying to balance the demands of academia, their studies, and their sport. So trying to plan ahead and making sure you actually have the fuel you need when you're going to classes. Bringing lunches so you're not forced to go to the school cafeteria or the arena cafeteria. Athletes are elite and their diet should be too. I find a lot of time athletes have custom everything, custom costumes, custom skates kind of molded to their feet. So our diets should be as well. They should be customized to the individual to make sure that we can continue competing at that elite level. So trying our best to think about what we have going on during the day and ensuring we have the fuel for that. With figure skaters in particular in an artistic and appearance-based sport, approaching this with a healthy mindset of, do I want this food? How will this food give me energy? How much food do I need today? And what can I eat so I can skate my best? Lastly, working with a sport dietitian. In a lot of sporting communities and associations within the IST, there is oftentimes a sport medicine doctor, there's a physiotherapist, athletic trainer, mental performance coach, strength and conditioning coach, and just recently the dietitian or nutrition expert has been added to that team, and seeing a lot of really cool findings with incorporating a nutritionist or dietitian into the team. Nutrition is very individualized. No plan for two athletes will ever be the same. It is just very one size fits all. Not one size fits all, sorry. Sports dietitians can help athletes manage energy and nutrient needs, so if we are seeing some of the red flags for Red S or LEA, trying to approach that and treat it in a timely fashion so we can prevent long-term damages, such as with the bone injuries. So just a short recap, underfueling has many mental, physiological, and performance consequences. We do need nutrition and lots of it, very high quantities of it, to sustain health and our energy levels specifically in this elite population. And if we prioritize health, our performance will thrive. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. We all know that nutrition is as important, and I know that each and every one of us struggle with our nutrition every day, but it's important to see the differences that our athletes need to eat depending on what the training is through the week, and the importance of them having enough nutrition so they don't develop a low energy availability. Our REDS, or RED syndrome as it's called, is very, very important in our performance. And lots of times when we talk to our athletes about their nutrition, and particularly in athletic sports, They want to make sure that they look good no matter what they're doing, whether they're dancers or figure skaters or gymnasts. It's important that they understand that their nutrition is directly related to their performance. They can perform better if they have adequate nutrition. And so educating them with regards to adequate nutrition, proper nutrition, relative to what they're doing in their training, whether it's a rest day or a competition day, is extremely important. So thank you very much, Erin, for pointing your excellent nutrition speaker. This is open for questions now. I've left a lot of time for questions for anyone that's online. Please sign in and let us know if you have any questions. And certainly in the audience, our speakers are here with their expertise to answer any of your questions. I think they've given us lots to think about in their presentations. And if you have any questions for any of them, this is your opportunity to, get what you can out of them while they're here. Yeah.
Can I start? So, quantitation of what you're trying to provide is very important, especially to give guidance to those, novice and pre-novice coaches that, may or may not have read their, Skate Canada long-term athlete development plan, where on page 6, all, 6 important things, including the services you have, are outlined. But trying to secure that, even when you know it and you want to buy it, is hard. Okay, so there's those 6 pillars, but you haven't tried to spend money on sports psychologists, nutritionists, and whatever other help. You're lucky if you can get to 1% of the budget on each of those, not because you didn't want to spend the money, but because it wasn't available or it wasn't supported. You help quantify with exercise physiology. These kids should be probably measured, for every 4 months, to have that. Can you kind of quantify how much time one should have with a sports psychologist in a year, okay? Or how many visits with a dietitian in a year for, not just the athletes that are out here right now, but even the ones that are 3, 4, 5 years younger? Some kind of basic, how much should we be spending, or the parents or the coaches, in time and money and resources?
Shall I start with that? I would suggest that it's a really tough question for the psychology piece because of the lack of research, specifically on that intersection between high-performance athlete, youth, and mental health. However, this is where I would start based on my clinical knowledge and my instincts. And I think that, we do need some funding around research to be done, but maybe undertaking a bit of a pilot. What I would start with is, at minimum, a once-a-year check-in with all the athletes, 1 to 2 hour session with a qualified sports psychologist who, if we're talking about this population, has got some expertise in youth. Because, as I mentioned, these are not mini adults. They have unique brains. So 1 to 2 hours per year minimum check-in. How is this athlete doing? With a screen for psychological well-being, screening for depression, anxiety, disordered eating, body dysmorphia, possibly substance use as well. That starts frighteningly young, a maladaptive coping mechanism for dealing with stress, okay? Other disorders as well, but I would start with that. And if your athlete screens positive, I believe that they should be connected, again, with a sports psychologist with specialization in youth and undertake something called brief solution-focused therapy, okay, which might be very effective for the athlete, 4 to 6 sessions, okay? That's where I would start. Ideally, there'd be longitudinal research to determine if that starting point was effective, and modifications would be undertaken from there. I wish I had more concrete answers for you, but based on the lack of empirical data, the lack of study in this area, it's a tough one to answer.
That's great, thank you. And how about for nutrition?
Yeah.
So for performance nutrition, similar approach, it would be very individualized based on the athlete and whether they screen positive for disordered eating, negative relationship with food, negative relationship with their body. So usually it would be a 1-hour assessment and then follow up either every 2 weeks if they do flag positive for a lot of those issues, or once a month just for ongoing support and kind of dialing in of the nutrition plan.
I'd just like to add to that as well for physicians, sports medicine physicians. There is a mental health toolkit that the IOC has developed. It's on their website, and it's a screening, just like you would do your pre-participation physical, you do your pre-participation mental health toolkit. And so the screening for that, and if there's any red flags from that initial toolkit, you go on to the next stage, and from there it delineates it, and from there you could screen your athletes to the psychologist.
That's an excellent development that the sport has undertaken. Yeah.
And it's been rolled out in the last 2 to 3 years, and it's refined, so it's easy to do. The athlete fills out part of it. It's a checklist, and I would highly recommend all of the trainers. It can be applied by a trainer or a physician, so it's easily accessible, and it's on the website, the IOC Mental Health Toolkit. Do we have other questions?
I have a suggestion.
Yes?
Just because I'm not singing, that's okay.
It's for the
It's
audience
for the
at home.
online people, so they can hear you.
No, okay. Because I'm not 200% agree for what I heard today. I just have a suggestion for ISU, because we are the medical part of the ISU. Taking the nutrition part, may we introduce that part in the seminar, in development seminar for the kids, and check the diet that they should have when they do the seminar, when they go to some high-level international competition. This one, treat them like a Formula One machine. You cannot put any gas inside.
That's an excellent suggestion, and I think adding it to the seminars would be, I think
Because
that's
this is
very
important because,
doable.
I personally have experience with skater that they change completely the way to skate with the nutrition, and then we have to change also mentally the stuff. Is something that as like coaches we have to understand that it's not just put the skates and go there and skate. The game is not that one anymore. But it's very important that also that when we go to some places very important, like this competition level, world level, or we go to the seminar, it's not because we have no budget. I'm sorry to say this. We have to reduce from the food, because it's the fuel that we give to the kids. And that is very, very important for them. Thank you very much to give me that opportunity.
Thank you for that very important point, and I couldn't agree with you more. Are you all awake?
Sorry, I do have another question. So I've watched the testing that the kids have gone through at the carded level, so through CSI, at least in Ontario. So that's the Canadian Sports Institute for those at home. And it's been, where vitamin D would get tested and ferritins would get tested, but I think some of the testing seemed a little haphazard. So it wasn't, we're doing this and we're going to do it serially for every year for 5 years. It seemed to be on the whim of the latest master's project of what was sort of happening at CSI at the time. So is there sort of a recommendation for athletes at this level or younger that one should probably be recommending on a yearly basis? Should these kids be having, not all of them have access to CSI, but should we be telling coaches and parents that, probably every year these kids need a hemoglobin, they need a ferritin, is vitamin D still in? What is it, you know, without getting too sophisticated, what should we be, you know, monitoring or screening when making recommendations to people right now?
So you're looking for basically a minimal standard across the field of figure skating, what should be measured, and then maybe you know, this is what the minimum is and this is what the best would be.
And I think it varies depending on the context you're looking at. I've worked in both the Canadian and US healthcare system, and I think in the US they're very quick to do, okay, you know what, let's do screening for our athletes every year. And here, where we have a more publicly funded healthcare system, and there's lots of focus on not doing unnecessary screening, where I think we would focus maybe more on questions, and where athletes that will flag will then get blood work afterwards. So my approach usually would be all those things you talked about. Ferritin, if I'm seeing an athlete, we can ask about periods. When did they get their period for the first time? How often does it come? How much do they bleed? Lots of details that a lot of teenage girls don't think about. Or heavy bleeding runs in the family, and so they have the same periods as their mom, and they're not realizing that that volume of blood loss can lead to iron deficiency. Where are their sources of iron in their diet? And then if there's anything to me that flags as being potentially at risk for low iron, that's when I would put my screening in. Same for calcium and vitamin D. I know this is more general population for pediatrics, that it's not recommended to screen everybody for vitamin D deficiency, but I think you could, if there's risk factors, put that in your athlete screening. So I would say it would be more individualized than blanket screening. But I'm happy to hear opposing viewpoints.
No, I would agree with that. Working with community athletes and with athletes through CSI Calgary, very different approaches. Usually when we start seeing an athlete, we kind of like to get a baseline of where all their nutrient levels are at and where they may be lacking, so that we can really go in with the diet, fine-tooth comb, see what they're eating and where the gaps are, so we can address that early on. And then from there, just maintenance based on the individual, like Karen was saying.
Hi. Maybe adding to this question, are there any recommendations about the screenings at certain ages? Because, as you said, like athletes go through different developments, and they have different developments in the brain and regarding nutrition and other requirements they have for the training. Are there like differences in screenings you would suggest, or would you do the screenings through the years all the same, or like would you look at different points more or less?
Are there specific screenings that you're thinking about in particular?
Maybe also the physical screenings, because they tend to be more injured at certain ages in certain areas, or then also regarding the development of the brain.
I think from a physical training standpoint, I don't think it necessarily has to be in a physician's office, but looking at biomechanics. So as athletes are going through growth, they have these periods, like I was saying, where you'll see muscle tightness, and then they'll work on their flexibility, it'll get back to appropriate, and then they grow more, and then it gets tight again. So that can either be with a coach or an off-ice trainer, having even depends on how much access you have, every 3 to 6 months, identifying are there areas from a biomechanics perspective that are out of the expected range for high-level physical performance.
I'll add to that. I would say like wave a magic wand, you know, no funding, whatever. Like in a perfect world, I'd love to see athletes have a musculoskeletal assessment at least every year, something done by like a physiotherapist or someone trained in that area, and see how they're moving. And then that can inform the strength and conditioning as well for the agility development and the coordination and maybe the core training and so on and so forth. So that's something I would love to see, you know, as early as you can get it, and often. And then for the physical training and testing, that would change through the years for sure. And typically our approach here is do more field testing at the younger ages. So for cardiovascular, you're doing like a léger, like a beep test, a 20-meter shuttle run, something general. What's their max heart rate? What's their capacity? Track that through the years. And then as they get into the more elite levels, junior, senior, then you can go into the lab and do some specific testing at that point and tease out some differences there.
And from a psychological perspective, I wouldn't necessarily recommend different screenings depending on age and stage of brain development, but what I would recommend, and adding to my previous answer, in addition to that, ideally a yearly screen or pre-competition screen, if your athlete has suffered a significant trauma in their life, if they have suffered significant loss, maybe if there has been a significant change in family makeup, you know, parental conflict, divorce. We're human, so we will have a psychological reaction to any and all of those things. But if the seeming psychological reaction is lasting beyond a month or two, because it takes a while for us to adjust and recover from trauma, from loss, from change. And naturally, many people do recover. However, if your athlete isn't recovering, it's been a month or two since that big thing in their life that didn't go so well, rescreen them. And where possible, provide them with access to appropriate resources.
Thank you. Those are all very relevant and good answers. And I think that all of our athletes at this stage do have a primary care provider. They do see either their physician and they see their physiotherapist or the massage therapist regularly. And at least doing a physical and a mental screening once a year is very beneficial, because if you do it when they're young, you can catch, you know, inherent biomechanical abnormalities that can be noticed and recognized. They can be taught how to manage those so they don't end up with overuse injuries because their hips a little out of whack when they go to training. You can look at muscle imbalances too, and that can prevent overuse injuries that could take them out of their competitions or their training program. So I think once a year, a good biomechanical muscle imbalance training session along with a mental health screening, and you can also screen for concussion. We have an easy concussion screening program as well. So those are all things that can be done once a year to make sure that your athlete is starting out on the right track. And it gives you something also that if something traumatic does happen in their lives, or they're off in their training or they're off in their competition, you can go back to that baseline and recheck it and see if it's what it was before. So it gives you a reference point.
It's almost like you're talking about a yearly pre-participation screen.
Sort of like that, but I want to include the mental health in the pre-participation screen.
Yeah.
I have a question about the screening, like a screening day or a screening weekend. The Dutch Federation right now is really trying to bring up the figure skating, since we're pretty good at speed skating and in short track. We would like to be there too with figure skating. So we do have a lot of resources from that particular part. If I look at all four of you, I mean, you guys are super trained with these sort of things. What would you suggest, like every individual, as what to screen? Like there's so many things, like the brain, I mean, concussions, like for all of you, there's so many things that we can screen, we don't even know what to pick anymore. So for like a weekend, what would you suggest is like the most beneficial to screen? It's a very big question, I know, but like, I might as well ask it now.
So from a sport medicine perspective, there is through, I think it's the AMSSM, so the American Medical Society for Sport Medicine, they have some pre-participation screening guidelines specific for doctors that goes through general medical health, recent injuries. It does talk about concussion or previous concussions, does screen a little bit about periods for our female athletes, and does have a general musculoskeletal screen. I would say if we're talking more of like biomechanical issues, I would have someone who is specifically looking at that, maybe a physiotherapist. But there are like templates available for doctors when they're looking from a medical screening perspective. And that's also looking at stuff like risk for sudden cardiac death and things like that that we didn't cover today, but is also part of athlete health.
I really think, even though I'm the exercise physiologist here, that the priority is on first starting with the health of the athlete, doing the musculoskeletal screens, seeing the physician, doing the pre-participation, doing the questionnaire for the mental health, doing the dietitian, are they fueled well? And then you get the privilege of doing the athletic abilities, which I think is what we jump to first. So in terms of the athletic ability type things, I would break it down into those kind of three components I showed on that slide of strength, speed, endurance. So hitting something in each of those components, it's really assessing what is required in the sport of figure skating. So perhaps you're doing, at the younger levels, like I said, a beep test, a 20-meter shuttle run, just looking at a general cardiovascular fitness. For depending on the discipline, jumping is quite important. So maybe that gets your kind of speed, quick aspect, doing a jump test of some sort, speed, strength, and then, yeah, a strength component of some kind. As Dr. Bollinger said, core strength, I think, is really important for figure skaters. So some sort of core assessment would be a great place to start.
And I, in this population, would screen for depression, anxiety.
And you have the coaches, a lot of coaches.
Them too.
Is your anxiety higher during competition or training?
Depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia or disordered eating or relationship with food issues. And I would actually throw in a screen for substance use.
Okay, and from a nutritional standpoint, to go off of Dr. Hilson, pardon me, looking at relationship with the body and body dysmorphia sort of thing, because that all lies on a continuum with disordered eating and relationship with food. And then the IOC has a screening tool for RED-S called the RED-S CAT, or the clinical assessment tool. And it kind of looks at the signs and symptoms and clinical red flags of RED-S based on a red light, high risk, yellow light, kind of moderate risk, green light, low risk of all of those different symptoms.
So there's lots of, it sounds like from you guys and from what we have, there are lots of screening tools available, and it's just making sure that you have the right professionals there to interpret it. And if you pick up something, the resources available to the athlete. Like there's no point on screening for depression, finding suicidality, and not knowing what to do with it. So having those resources in place would be important.
And I would add that those screening tools, you don't need a specialist to use them.
Yes.
They can be applied by a physician, therapist, etc. So they've been developed so that they can be used in novice sport, junior sport, without high-profile team available. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, then I thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for those online. I hope that today, we've had not only some insight into developing the elite adolescent athlete, but also some practical implementations that we can take for our athletes home and hopefully encourage the athletes and the coaches and trainers to use them so that we can continue to progress our elite junior skaters and keep them healthy as we continue to watch their beautiful performances. Thank you again.
He's funny.
Joan, all your stuff on identity, I wanted to throw in a plug of like the main risk for poor recovery from injury is high athletic identity. Because you don't have, I was like just about to throw it.
There's not a balance.
Because if you are injured and you
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions.
if you can't participate in your sport and that's your identity, their mental health suffers dramatically.
Exactly.
So I was very happy when you put that in there as the like prevention